The emergency call came just after 11:20 at night. A woman was dying inside a room designed to sell fantasies. The report was brief, clinical, and devoid of emotion. A call placed from a high-end entertainment establishment in Tokyo. A female employee. Severe injuries to the neck and abdomen. Loss of consciousness. Transported to a nearby hospital. Pronounced dead shortly after arrival. For many in Japan, the details alone were enough to summon familiar assumptions. A violent dispute inside the red light district. Money? Jealousy? A secret relationship gone wrong. The public imagination moved quickly, filling in the blanks with stories it had heard countless times before. In places where desire is commodified and intimacy is rented by the hour, tragedy often feels predictable. But every one of those assumptions was wrong. There was no financial dispute between the two. No illicit romance. No long-standing grudge. No history that could explain the violence in any rational way. According to investigators, the victim and the man who would take her life were, in every meaningful sense, strangers. And it was precisely that absence of connection that made this case so disturbing. The woman had been standing at the threshold of a different life. At 38, she was nearing the end of a career she never intended to keep forever. She was engaged, planning her future carefully, saving money for a small business of her own. A quiet exit from a world built on illusions and an ordinary happiness waiting just beyond it. That future ended inside a private room in Yoshiwara. Yoshiwara is a place where time behaves differently. Neon lights erase the difference between night and day. Music leaks into narrow streets that never truly sleep. For decades, it has existed as a space where rules are suspended, where emotions are packaged and sold with practiced precision. It is not chaos. It is an industry. One that depends on the careful performance of affection without attachment. The establishment where the crime occurred specialized in something more refined than physical pleasure. It sold the experience of being desired, of being listened to, of being, if only briefly, the center of someone else's world. The women who worked there were trained to maintain that illusion flawlessly, while never allowing it to cross into reality. On the night she was killed, her schedule appeared routine. A single booking. 110 minutes. A name she did not recognize. Nothing that warranted concern. Inside the room, however, something was already wrong. The air felt heavy. Conversation did not flow as it should have. The man across from her said little. His posture was closed. His gaze avoided hers, then lingered too long. When their eyes finally met, she understood what her instincts had been trying to warn her about. She had seen him before. He was not supposed to be there. In that moment, she faced a decision that countless women in similar professions are forced to make. React and risk escalation. Remain calm and hope the situation ends quietly. She chose professionalism. She chose silence. She chose to wait for time to pass. When the session ended and the door closed behind him, she believed she had survived the encounter. She believed the nightmare had ended. She was wrong. Yoshiwara was never designed to be understood from the outside. To those who only passed through its neon-soaked streets, it appeared chaotic, indulgent, and morally ambiguous. But beneath the lights and music, it operated with precision. Every interaction was regulated. Every service carefully defined. And every boundary, at least on paper, was clear. For decades, the district had survived by adapting. As laws tightened and public attitudes shifted, the industry learned to rebrand itself. What was once openly transactional evolved into something more abstract. Desire became emotional rather than physical. Intimacy became an experience rather than an act. The product was no longer the body. It was attention. The establishment known as Yuzuki represented the refined end of that evolution. Unlike many venues in the area, Yuzuki did not advertise excess. Its exterior was discreet. Its interior controlled. Entry required reservations, background checks, and adherence to strict behavioral rules. Customers were not promised sex. They were promised time, conversation, the illusion of mutual interest crafted with meticulous care. The women who worked there were selected and trained accordingly. Physical beauty was expected, but it was not enough. They were taught how to read men quickly, how to listen without revealing themselves, how to create warmth without attachment, how to make a stranger feel uniquely understood while remaining fundamentally unreachable. Most clients understood the arrangement. They arrived with expectations shaped by experience. They paid. They enjoyed the performance. They left. For them, the transaction was clean, temporary, forgettable. Online reviews reflected this mindset. Customers described satisfaction, novelty, relaxation. Some returned regularly. Many did not. Names changed. Faces blurred. The rules were followed. But systems built on illusion always carry risk. Because while the service depended on fantasy, it also depended on the assumption that fantasy would remain contained. That clients would not confuse attention with affection. That admiration would not curdle into entitlement. That desire would dissolve once the clock ran out. The majority complied. A minority did not. It was within this environment that the victim became indispensable. By her late 30s, she had established herself as one of Yuzuki's most sought-after employees. Her bookings filled quickly. Her name sat consistently at the top of internal rankings. Management relied on her not only for revenue but for stability. She handled difficult clients with composure. She followed protocol precisely. She never crossed lines. Her appeal was not overtly dramatic. It was controlled. She offered calm reassurance, a listening ear, subtle affirmation. Men left her company feeling restored rather than consumed. And yet that restraint made her dangerous in ways few anticipated. For certain clients, her professionalism was misinterpreted. Boundaries became invisible. Politeness was mistaken for preference. Consistency was read as loyalty. The illusion she sold so skillfully began to take root in places where it should not have survived. From the outside, her life appeared settled. She was nearing an exit from the industry. She had plans, financial goals, a partner waiting beyond the walls of Yoshiwara. She understood the world she worked in, and she believed she understood how to leave it. But the system she trusted had blind spots. Security protocols focused on physical threats, aggression, disorderly conduct, visible intoxication. Clients who shouted, touched without permission, or violated rules openly were identified and removed. Names were recorded, faces remembered, bans enforced. What proved harder to detect were quiet fixations. The man who would later be identified as her killer did not fit the profile of immediate danger. He did not cause disturbances at first. He paid. He returned. He followed instructions. He watched. He listened. He absorbed the illusion without questioning its nature. In private, however, the fantasy grew unchecked. Investigators later determined that his visits had begun the year prior, that he had spent far beyond his means, that he had rearranged his life around brief, scheduled encounters that held significance only for him. To the establishment, he was one customer among many. To her, he was one face in a rotation designed to leave no lasting imprint. That imbalance was fatal. When his behavior began to shift, it was subtle. Questions lingered too long. Comments edged toward exclusivity. Jealousy surfaced where none was warranted. She responded as trained, redirecting conversation, reinforcing boundaries, alerting management when discomfort escalated. Eventually, the decision was made to bar him. From Yuzuki's perspective, the solution was straightforward. Access revoked. Reservations blocked. The system corrected itself. What followed, however, was not accounted for, because exclusion did not end the fantasy. It intensified it. For the man who had already surrendered his sense of self to illusion, rejection did not signal closure. It signaled loss, humiliation, an erasure of meaning he could not replace. In his mind, the boundary she enforced was not professional. It was personal. And personal wounds demand resolution. The ban created distance, but it did not create safety. It merely pushed obsession out of view. Removed from the regulated environment of Yuzuki, his fixation had space to evolve without oversight, without correction, without interruption. What management could not see was how easily the system could be bypassed. New names, new phone numbers, a different appearance. Small adjustments that allowed a determined individual to slip back into a place designed to feel secure. On the night of the booking that would end her life, nothing appeared out of place. The reservation was accepted, the name unfamiliar, the duration unremarkable. There were no alerts, no warnings, no visible threat. Only a man who had decided that the illusion owed him more than it ever promised. Her popularity did not only attract admiration, it also attracted something far more dangerous. The man, later identified by investigators, lived a life that left little trace. He was employed as a contract security guard, earning just enough to survive. His days followed a rigid pattern: work, return to a shared dormitory near his job site, eat alone, sleep, repeat. There were no close friendships, no romantic history of significance, no visible ambitions beyond maintaining routine. By most external measures, he was unremarkable. What distinguished him was not violence, but emptiness. According to records obtained during the investigation, his isolation had deepened in the years leading up to the crime. Communication with family members was limited. Social interactions were minimal. His identity had narrowed to work and nothing more. It was within that vacuum that the illusion offered by Yuzuki found fertile ground. He first encountered the victim in early 2022. The meeting followed the same structure as countless others: a reservation, a private room, polite conversation, carefully curated attention. For her, it was one session among many. For him, it was an interruption to a life defined by absence. Within that controlled space, he experienced something unfamiliar: validation, warmth, the sensation of being noticed. He returned. At first, his behavior mirrored that of other repeat clients: regular bookings, predictable conduct, generous spending, but gradually the frequency increased. He adjusted his finances to accommodate more visits. Savings were depleted. Loans were taken. Investigators later confirmed that he borrowed more than 3 million yen from relatives, money he could not realistically repay. The illusion had become a priority. What he failed to recognize was that the experience he valued so deeply was a performance designed to remain incomplete. The victim did not share personal details. She did not initiate contact outside of scheduled sessions. She maintained professional distance. To management, this restraint was proof of reliability. To him, it became a provocation. He began to test boundaries. Questions shifted in tone. Comments hinted at exclusivity. He asked about other clients, expressed displeasure at the idea that she might offer the same attention to others. When she redirected the conversation, he interpreted it as denial rather than policy. The imbalance grew. From her perspective, the change was unsettling but familiar. In an industry built on emotional labor, clients occasionally developed attachments that exceeded acceptable limits. The established protocol was clear. Document concerns, notify management, allow supervisors to intervene. She followed those steps precisely. Management reviewed his behavior and issued a warning. When that failed to correct the issue, his access to the establishment was revoked. His name was added to a blacklist. Reservations from his contact information were blocked. Security was instructed to deny him entry. Within the system, the problem appeared resolved. Outside of it, something fractured. For the man, the ban represented more than loss of access. It represented erasure. The place where he felt visible had rejected him. The person he had centered his emotional world around had, in his mind, betrayed an unspoken bond. The distinction between service and affection, always present, now felt like an insult. Rather than disengage, he fixated. He changed phone numbers, created new accounts, purchased clothing intended to obscure recognition, a hat, a wig, a lowered gaze. He rehearsed restraint, planned silence, learned how to pass unnoticed. Each step was deliberate. Each adjustment reinforced a belief that re-entry was not only possible but justified. During questioning, investigators would later note the absence of panic in his actions. He did not describe rage. He described determination. The conviction that he had been wronged, that the system had taken something from him that could not be replaced. The decision to return was not impulsive. On the day of the crime, he prepared carefully. He selected a time slot long enough to ensure privacy. 110 minutes. He brought sufficient cash. He also carried an item purchased online days earlier. A specialized blade. Cold, concealable, chosen with intent. When he arrived, no alarms were triggered. The reservation appeared legitimate. The name unfamiliar. His appearance altered enough to avoid recognition. Security procedures designed to deter spontaneous threats did not account for someone willing to adapt patiently. Inside the room, he behaved as planned. He spoke little, avoided attention, maintained control. When she recognized him, the shift was immediate. But by then, the door was closed. The clock was running. And the power dynamics she relied on no longer existed. Investigators later reconstructed his mental state during that period. He did not perceive the situation as confrontation. He perceived it as culmination. A final encounter meant to resolve what he believed had been left unfinished. In his statement, he described feeling humiliated by rejection, discarded, reduced to nothing. He spoke of despair, of thoughts of ending his own life. But despair alone did not explain what followed. What emerged instead was something colder. If he could not possess the illusion that sustained him, then no one should. If his world had collapsed, then the source of his longing should not continue to shine. The fantasy that had once offered comfort now demanded destruction. He did not come seeking reconciliation. He came seeking control. That distinction mattered because it reframed the crime not as a moment of lost restraint, but as an assertion of ownership. A belief that access, once granted, could not be revoked. That payment implied entitlement. That rejection warranted punishment. By the time the session ended, his decision had already been made. He stood up, adjusted his clothing, left the room without incident. The performance concluded. The illusion in his mind expired. What followed occurred beyond the boundaries of the service itself. In the corridor reserved for staff moments after departure, he acted. The weapon he carried was no longer symbolic. It was used, first against her, then against himself, not as escape but as punctuation. An attempt to define the narrative on his terms. When asked later why he had done it, his response unsettled even seasoned investigators. He said he wanted to steal her shining life. That night he did not come as a customer. He came with a decision. The final sequence of events unfolded with unsettling speed. After the man exited the private room, the corridor outside returned briefly to its normal rhythm. Staff moved between appointments. Doors opened and closed. No one raised an alarm. Within the architecture of the establishment, the transaction had ended cleanly. The session time had expired. The customer had left. Inside the room, the victim allowed herself a moment of relief. Investigators later concluded that she believed the danger had passed. The encounter had been tense but uneventful. She had endured the silence. She had followed protocol. She had survived another uncomfortable booking. In an industry where vigilance was constant, survival often felt like success. She stepped into the bathroom to compose herself. Minutes later, a scream tore through the controlled quiet of the staff-only area. Employees rushed toward the sound. What they found defied the order the establishment worked so hard to maintain. The victim lay collapsed on the floor, bleeding heavily from wounds to her neck and abdomen. There were signs of a sudden, close-range attack. No prolonged struggle. No opportunity for escape. Emergency services were contacted immediately. The call, placed at 11:20, was recorded with the same procedural clarity as thousands before it. A woman injured, unconscious, critical condition. Paramedics arrived within minutes. She was transported to the hospital without delay. She never regained consciousness. Despite medical intervention, the injuries proved fatal. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The official cause of death listed extensive blood loss resulting from sharp force trauma. At nearly the same time, staff discovered a man collapsed in a nearby corridor. He was clutching his abdomen. The wound was self-inflicted. The weapon used to attack the victim lay close by. He was conscious but fading. When questioned by employees before losing awareness, he offered only a single statement. "I did something I should not have done." He survived. Police secured the scene and began reconstructing the timeline. Surveillance footage confirmed the sequence: his departure from the room, the brief gap, his movement through staff areas, the absence of interference, the attack, the self-inflicted injury. There was no evidence of hesitation. During formal interrogation, his account was coherent. He acknowledged planning the encounter. He admitted to bringing the blade. He did not dispute responsibility. What unsettled investigators was not denial but justification. He described feeling humiliated after being barred from the establishment. He spoke of despair and thoughts of ending his own life. But then he explained a different idea took shape. Why should he be the only one to suffer? Why should the woman who represented everything he lacked continue living freely? According to transcripts, his words were precise. He said he wanted to take away her shining life. To him, the act was not revenge in the traditional sense. It was correction. An attempt to equalize a world he believed had treated him unfairly. If he could not possess the illusion she embodied, then it should not exist at all. The investigation revealed the extent of his preparation, the purchase history of the weapon, the changes to his appearance, the effort invested in bypassing security protocols, the deliberate choice of timing, the controlled demeanor during the session itself. This was not an impulsive outburst. It was a conclusion reached over months. As details emerged, public reaction shifted from shock to anger. Sympathy for his isolation evaporated in the face of premeditation. The narrative of a troubled man gave way to a harsher truth. Obsession, left unchecked, had matured into entitlement. Entitlement had demanded punishment. The trial began months later. In court, the defense argued diminished intent. They claimed the weapon had been intended for self-harm, not murder. That he had only wished to see her one last time. That his mental state was unstable. That his actions were driven by despair rather than malice. The prosecution dismantled those claims methodically. Evidence showed planning, concealment, deception. The order of events contradicted the narrative of suicide. The attack occurred after the session, not during. The location indicated pursuit, not confrontation. The injuries inflicted were consistent with intent to kill. The court was unmoved. On November 28, 2023, the verdict was delivered. 16 years in prison. A sentence within the legal framework, but one that provoked outrage. For the victim's family, it felt insufficient. A life extinguished. A future erased. Reduced to a number. One exchange during the trial lingered in public memory. The defense asked whether it would have been possible for the defendant to meet the victim outside the establishment had he paid for additional services. He answered yes. When asked whether the victim had ever suggested or permitted such contact, he answered no. The implication was unavoidable. The boundary had always been there. The fantasy had never extended beyond the transaction. The intimacy had never belonged to him. What he lost was not a relationship, but an illusion he refused to relinquish. In the aftermath, attention turned to the victim herself. She had been preparing to leave the industry. She was engaged. She dreamed of designing lingerie, of opening a small shop funded by years of disciplined saving. She wanted a life defined by choice rather than performance. Friends described her as cautious, optimistic, determined. She was weeks, perhaps months, from crossing that threshold. Instead, her life ended in a corridor she was never meant to fear, at the hands of someone who believed admiration justified destruction. The case closed legally, but its implications lingered. It exposed the fragile line between fantasy and delusion. The danger of systems that rely on emotional labor without acknowledging its risks. And the cost paid by those who navigate illusion with professionalism, trusting that boundaries will protect them. They do not always. By the time the truth emerged, her future was already gone. The case was officially closed with a sentence, but nothing about it felt resolved. In the weeks following the verdict, public attention gradually shifted elsewhere. News cycles moved on. Another tragedy replaced this one in headlines. But for those closest to the victim, time did not soften what had been taken. A life built on restraint, patience, and careful planning had ended without warning, erased by a decision made in silence. 16 years in prison was the number the law produced. It accounted for procedure, intent, and precedent. It balanced responsibility with mitigation. On paper, it represented justice. In reality, it felt abstract. No calculation could translate absence into equivalence. No sentence could return what had been lost. The defendant offered no apology that carried meaning. His statements remained consistent. He spoke of despair, of humiliation, of emotional pain. He never spoke of her future, of the life he had interrupted, of the years she had spent preparing to leave the world that ultimately became her grave. That imbalance remained the most disturbing element of the case. Throughout the investigation and trial, one fact stood unchallenged. The victim had never violated professional boundaries. She had not encouraged private contact. She had not promised affection. She had not offered anything beyond what was explicitly defined as part of her work. The illusion she sold was controlled, limited, and temporary. The violence that followed was not the result of deception. It was the result of refusal. A refusal to accept that attention did not imply ownership, that payment did not guarantee permanence, that admiration did not grant authority over another person's existence. In this sense, the crime did not originate in Yoshiwara. It originated in the moment fantasy was mistaken for entitlement. Her friends spoke quietly about the plans she never reached. A small shop, original designs, a wedding she had already begun preparing for. She wanted anonymity, stability, a life measured not by performance but by choice. Those ambitions were ordinary. That ordinariness made the loss heavier. She did not die because she took risks. She died because someone else could not accept limits. The case exposed a vulnerability embedded within industries built on emotional labor. When feelings are simulated for survival, they can be misinterpreted by those desperate enough to believe them. Systems may enforce rules, but they cannot fully account for fixation. Boundaries can be defined, but they cannot guarantee safety when illusion is mistaken for truth. What remains long after the courtroom emptied is a caution that extends beyond this single incident. Obsession does not announce itself as danger. It often presents as devotion, as longing, as pain-seeking relief. But when admiration transforms into ownership, the outcome is rarely contained. She sold fantasies for a living, carefully, professionally, with an understanding that they were meant to end. One man decided that her life should end with them. She sold fantasies for a living. And one man decided she no longer deserved a life beyond them.